Well, I think everyone should care in any country because diplomacy, in this case American diplomacy, and what the US Foreign Service does every day actually affects people's lives in the United States and in other countries. And if you ask the average person in any country what they most care about, they probably will tell you two main things: their personal safety, their physical security, and their economic well-being, their prosperity. And there is a direct link between those two things and what American diplomats do every day, and probably applies to the diplomats in most countries in the world. Well, the biggest misconception is that diplomacy is not a real profession. I find many people in the United States and in other countries think that anyone can do diplomacy, coming from any field, any walk of life. And that may be the case, but you need to have some training, some foundation on which to build, because we are not all born diplomats. And if you've been a successful academic or a lawyer or a journalist, doesn't mean that you would be a successful diplomat. So I think it's time for people to realize that diplomacy is not a hobby, that it is a real profession, it's a serious profession, and that there are things that can be taught in diplomacy that can then lead to a successful practice of diplomacy. Well, one of the main changes is that the US Foreign Service now has been asked to do many more things than it was doing before 9/11. And so in addition to what we consider classic diplomacy or traditional diplomacy, which is managing relations with foreign countries and representing your country abroad, they've had to now work in war zones, in Iraq and Afghanistan, in provinces away from capitals, trying to teach local governments, provincial governments, how to govern, meaning how to build schools and hospitals, how to pave roads, how to build infrastructure, how to set up a judicial system. That had been done to some extent back during the Vietnam era, but most of those people who served at the time were out of the Foreign Service by then. And so it was new to most people. And if it was done, there is this good governance agenda now that the US diplomacy is trying to bring about good governance to as many countries in the world as possible. And some of that was happening before, but it was very sporadic and it wasn't necessarily the policy of the United States. Now it is the agenda that, because the US government has decided that the only way for the United States to be truly secure and prosperous is for the entire world to be secure and prosperous, not the neighborhood, not the Western Hemisphere, the entire world. That leads to going to these countries or using the embassies that are already in those countries and trying to get these governments there to be responsible, to practice what we call good governance. And if that's successful, it'll take obviously many years to accomplish, because there are many countries that currently have very weak governments. There are some failed states. There are clearly many non-democratic states. And democracy is not necessarily the agenda here. It's governance. If you have a country like Singapore, which some people would argue is not a real democracy because the same party has been in power since independence in 1963, but very few people would argue that Singapore does not practice good governance, because they do practice good governance. Because they're the permanent people at an embassy. They're not rotating every 2 or 3 years, as is the case at other posts, and in some cases 1 year in dangerous places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, where the assignment of each American officer is only 1 year. And so they're the institutional memory, if you like, of that post, wherever it may be. And also, when American officers move around, even if you're an economic officer and you're going from one economic job in Pakistan to an economic job in Spain, for example, the work is very different. Being an economic officer in Pakistan is very different from being an economic officer in Spain. And so these Foreign Service nationals, so local staff, locally employed staff, are then the people who would really teach the American officers some of the specificities and the particular way of doing things in Spain, for example, which they may not teach in Washington, because there are many countries in the world and there are 275 US diplomatic missions around the world. And not until you come to an embassy do you learn these particulars and the specificities of the situation? And the FSNs, or the local staff, actually those are the people who know those specificities. Well, I didn't realize that at the time, but because of the end of the Cold War in 1989, because of the role American diplomacy had played, when those events happened, I was 15, and so the things that have happened to me since then, the fact that I was able to go to the US and to go to Harvard and to work for the Financial Times and the Washington Times, travel with the Secretary of State, with 4 of them, in fact, for a decade, and write this most recent book, none of that would have happened had it not been for the role that American diplomacy played in ending the Cold War. And American diplomacy doesn't deserve all the credit for ending the Cold War, because many factors were there at work for that to happen. But clearly it played a role, and in that and in the subsequent transition to democracy and market economy in Eastern Central Europe. And so I, years later, realized that I am a beneficiary of American diplomacy. And I wanted to know if there were other people in the world, and was the impact of American diplomacy always positive, or was it sometimes negative?